1 year after the celebration of the Habitat 3 and the approval of the new urban agenda, we are going to see the Quito Papers. I would like to thank all our colleagues, Richard Sennett, Saskia Sassen, Ricky Verdet, and all the people that have participated in these Quito Papers, which has been an intellectual effort to talk with a meaningful manner and sense about urbanization in the beginning of the 21st century. In the preparation of Habitat 3, we had the opportunity to evaluate a little bit what has happened in urbanization in the last decades in order to see if there's a need to readdress the focus or the strategies of urbanization around the world. And I think that the answer to this quest has been positive. Yes, there is a need to readdress the direction where urbanization is going in currently. Because urbanization, unfortunately, it's being driven by commercial reasons, aspects. The function of the real estate sector in general has been overemphasized, and at the other side, the urban governance has been decreasing or has been questioned in many parts of the world. And physical planning, urban design has been decaying and has been becoming something out of fashion in many parts of the world. And the outcome of all these questions has been a decrease of the quality of urban planning and design. It has been a diminishing of the provision of public space, which is a very dramatic aspect of urbanization. We have seen a huge proliferation of gated communities as an example of probably the most clear example of the failure of urbanization, because when we are faced to the need to gate our neighborhoods, it means that something very fundamental is failing in the urban management or in the urban fabric or in the urban process. And therefore, I think that we need to recapitulate, we need to rethink very seriously where urbanization is going. And the Quito Papers provide quite a number of ideas that critically analyze what is going on, why, and how can we address it in the forthcoming decades. I think that one of the subjects that we had in our conversation in this process was the relevance of the modern movement that in the 30s of the last century came up with the Charter of Athens with a kind of set of ideas which defined the most contemporary and modern ideas at that moment. It was soon after the proliferation of the car as the new technology. The disruptive technology at that time was the car, but also it was after the social revolution in Russia and in other parts of the world, and also the emergence of new ideas approaching the social model of living together. Of course, it embraced a lot of progressive ideas about the right of the people to have a decent life and a decent housing. But the modern movement then immediately was challenged mainly by the Second World War And after the Second World War, the things were very different from what the 30s were, including the big financial crisis of 1929. And after the Second World War, something very different emerged, which picked some of the ideas of the modern movement, but forgetting quite a number of the rest of ideas. And the issues of the ideas like the tower in the park or the relevance of the car were totally embraced, but the equality of public housing for everybody was abandoned also with the same speed. And therefore, what came after the Second World War, it was a much more problematic urbanization model, which we tend to call it the international model, because it's a model that is repeated by the industry, mainly by the real estate industry, in a very similar manner in all of the cities of the world, irrespectively of culture, physical surroundings or a scenario. If you are in the modern BCDs of the world, in many cases you will not have clues to distinguish, or you have not keys to distinguish where I am, in which city I am, because many of them, they look strictly similar because they are similar. They not just look similar. Unfortunately, they are similar. And therefore, it means that the quality and the quantity of information that urbanization transmits to the society, it's impoverished. It's falling down. Altogether, with the diminishing of the public space, it's generating a model of urbanization that it's in crisis. And we are seeing very different symptomatic crises of these aspects of this crisis, sorry. For example, one of the last is the increase in inequalities in urbanization, the specialization, the functional specialization of neighborhoods, this neighborhood for the rich, this for the poor, this for the immigrants, this for public housing, this for recreational aspect, this commercial, this industrial, and this segregation of the functionality of the uses of the land, it generates a huge demand of mobility, which is collapsing the cities. Because added to the increased demand of mobility, there's the design of the mobility. It's based in the big streets with a kind of motorway characteristic. And therefore, all that, it explains quite a number of the problems that cities are facing, both in the developed, but also, and in a special manner, in the developing world, where we usually face a very committed private sector to build and a very weak public sector to govern. And this is really, a challenge that needs to be corrected, needs to be addressed, of course, wisely, not in a, in an authoritarian or in an inadequate manner, but needs to be addressed if we think or if we expect or we hope that urbanization is going to deliver the kind of goods that we associate historically to urbanization. Therefore, thank you to the colleagues for the Quito Papers, and let's hope that they introduce some kind of new light to the conversation that is taking a stance worldwide after the celebration of Habitat 3 and the approval of the new urban agenda. Thank you.
Hello. Mike, can you hear me? Good afternoon. On behalf of the government of Ecuador, it is my pleasure to be present today, precisely when we observe the World Cities Days 2017. A couple of weeks ago, the international community also commemorated the first anniversary of the inauguration of the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, my city, located in Ecuador. The report by the UN Secretary General on Agenda Item 20, implementation of the outcomes of the United Nations conferences on human settlements and on housing and sustainable urban development, and strengthening of the United Nations Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, highlighted figures that consolidated the legacy of one of the most successful United Nations conferences so far. We had over 30,000 representatives and individuals and 167 country delegations, constituting the largest participation of civil society, stakeholders, and local authorities in the history of the United Nations conferences. More than 50,000 people attended its 8 plenary meetings, 6 high-level roundtables, 4 assemblies, 10 policy dialogues, 22 special sessions, 3 urban talks, 59 UN events, 15 UN exhibitions, 42 Habitat 3 village projects, 2018 side events, and 144 exhibition booths. Its main outcome, the intergovernmentally agreed New Urban Agenda, has been translated into the 6 UN official languages, and also to Albanian, Czech, German, Indonesian, Malaysian, and Portuguese. And consistent with its inclusivity inception, Braille and audio versions will be available as well. Perhaps the most important feature was the Habitat 3, with the background of the city of Quito, the first city declared World Cultural Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1978, constituted a perfect venue to gather together national, regional, subnational, and local governments with all relevant stakeholders as policy developers rather than only implementers, living true with its commitment to achieve an inclusive, sustainable urban development for all, with the overarching theme of leaving no one behind, is consolidated in the urban setting. We reaffirm that the policy leadership of the national government and the participation of all relevant stakeholders are fundamental to achieve this common purpose with the support of the United Nations Developing System, UN Habitat, and other related special agencies. In this regard, the government of Ecuador, recognizing the housing and sustainable urban development have a major role for our citizens and inhabitants alike to achieve sustainable development, and along the spirit of the new urban agenda, has launched the national plan, A House for All, which aims to build, according to technical specifications, 325,000 homes within the next 4 years in order to address the housing deficit. 60% of these houses will be handed free of charge to low-income or vulnerable families, and for the remaining 40%, a financing plan with very reasonable installments and term is contemplated. Now is the time to act. We all must join forces for the implementation and monitoring of the new urban agenda, strengthening inclusiveness and banishing segregation in the urban and rural space through a change in the urban paradigm based on the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. In this regard, Ecuador highlights the importance of the progressive recognition of the right of the city. Ecuador also restates the proposal by Mr. John Claus on the convenience for local authorities to adopt the new urban agenda in their parliaments as the political guide for their future work. Without the active participation of local governments and civil society, national governments will be not able to fulfill the objectives of this agenda. For the government of Ecuador and the people of Ecuador, it was a true honor to host Habitat 3, and we all look forward to welcoming you again in our country. After this word, we're going to see a short film about the Quito Papers towards the open city, and then we're going to finally enjoy the conversation between Michael Kimmelman, the architectural critic of the New York Times, contributing authors Richard Sennett and Saskia Sassen, and urbanist Eugene Birch. Thank you very much for your presence, and enjoy the afternoon.
The definition of the city that I like most is the definition that says the city is the place where you find what you are not looking for.
A city is a complex but incomplete space.
The thing that distinguishes a city from just a place which has got lots of people living close together is that those different groups interact.
Most people making decisions in cities don't get it. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of bringing a whole new field that understands the social processes and the physical process at the same time.
À l'environnement favorable nécessitant donc des cadres juridiques adéquats.
Document that in front of all of us, the new urban agenda.
Different countries have different realities and dynamics.
Cities are going to take the action because governments are sclerotic with this.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The presentation tonight really touches, as you can see, on three massive themes of importance for Habitat 3, which is how do you actually design cities in the wider sense of the word, not just physical design, but governance, and also how does one relate to environmental, ecological, social, and economic issues.
Hablar de la ciudad hoy no es solamente hablar de la ciudad, es hablar de una pérdida masiva de hábitat.
El futuro no está predeterminado. No estamos castigados a tener mala ciudad de una forma determinística.
2.5 years ago, Juan Clos and I were having a drink, and I asked him, have you read the Charter of Athens? This enormously influential document.
To explain the Charter of Athens, which was more or less conceived in 1933 on a great ship going across the Mediterranean, you've got to probably go back a little bit more to understand context. The early part of the 20th century was thought of as the machine age. New forms of production were coming into process, affecting everyone's lives. The car was beginning to dominate the way we moved around in cities and in the world.
They had a dream, and that dream was that a city could be organized to work like a beautiful machine.
We've got to remember that then, in the 1930s, the city was seen as overcrowded, dark, and actually negative in terms of well-being. So if you believe in the machine age, if you believe in rationalist principles, what you do, you clean it up. And you do that by taking all the different functions and separating them out. You put people to sleep there, and you put people to work there, and you go and entertain yourself there. You connect them by nice motorways with cars.
That's a view of what Le Corbusier imagined for Paris, making the city as a machine, putting people in towers, and having a cruciform shape so that you could get fresh air and improve the health of the people there. What was actually ruined in that process was the street, was the continuity and the sense of cohesion.
The problems today that we have in urbanism is that we design cities to be closed in the sense that there's a tight bond between form and function in how people experience the city.
I would say that most of the principles of the 30s Charter are still quite dominant. The notion that there's a CBD somewhere, a central business district, then out there are towers of housing, all linked by large freeways and motorways. Those more or less are the principles of the Charter of Athens from 70 years ago. Even though arguments about sustainability, arguments about social cohesion, arguments about integration really should be taking the city in the opposite direction.
Confronted with some of these trends, I like to ask, who owns the city? In the city, those without power can stand up and say, we're present, that this is also our city. That is, to me, what marks the city, and that is why mere built-up density is not a city, and we need to protect that distinction.
A successful public space has to bring people together. There has to be fizz of interaction.
Once we accept that in the city, to have a decent life, we require a lot of commons. That the public land ends up being something between 60 or 70% of the total land of the city, which is very counterintuitive to the ones that they think that the market is governing urbanization. What governs the quality of good urban life is the provision of public land.
The beginning of creating an open city is to protect the public realm as something that belongs to the public, to resist the privatization of public space. Most of the public space in most cities is streets. It's a common good. Under kind of neoliberal capitalism, we've lost the notion that the public belongs to the public.
The last 30 years, what we see is the rise of logics of extraction, away from the dominance of mass consumption, which meant that even the most aggressive corporation or bank was interested in the sons and daughters of the middle classes doing better than their parents. When you switch to the dominance of a logic of extraction, none of that matters.
It's very difficult for the private owner to understand that the provision of public space is fundamental and in fact generates private value. The market is not a good urban planner.
When you see that the dominant logic is a logic of extraction, that means concentration, concentration, concentration. So this particular period has generated its own undoing, because in the end, you keep extracting, there's not much left.
The public realm is not something that simply can be reduced to profit and loss.
The Charter of Athens model is of great interest to the private sector in terms of promoting land investment or speculation. It's a very easy way to deal with cities, rather than this messy, organic, integrated way that we might find in pre-existing cities that have been there a long time and require much more negotiation. Expansion of cities is important as long as they're well planned. Well planned doesn't mean making an instant perfect city. It means providing the infrastructure of a messy and incremental city. Unless you get the physical infrastructure right, you don't get the potential for equity right.
The question of the equitable city is a difficult one. How can we make an intervention that alters the dominance of this logic of extraction? So for me, one of them is the importance of relocalizing pieces of the economy that today are basically exist as elements of franchises. So my rhetorical question there is always, do we really need a multinational corporation to have a cup of coffee? We need to find the way that whatever the consumption capacity of these modest neighborhoods, which is most of the neighborhoods in the world, whatever it is, we should maximize its recirculation.
This permanent effort to make the city a just place where every innovation is not owned by a minority and denied to the rest, or used by a minority to make more money.
There are lots of things we can do to bring an open city into being, to overlay different kinds of functions in the city so that they synergize.
The political classes, they need to enable a better distribution of the wealth that is getting produced. Because the mechanisms that lead to concentration at the top, we made those mechanisms. They did not fall from the sky. We altered the law. Those were critical decisions that were made in legislatures, that were made by the executive branch, that were made by judges, that were made, in a variety of settings. That needs to be changed.
Going in the opposite direction from the Charter of Athens actually means understanding what density, complexity, and overlapping of different functions so that you have something happening in the city at different times of day and night for different people, the open city, not a closed, walled place where people of difference can't come together.
The open city is based on the notion that an environment becomes more and more complex. And how do you manage it rather than try and simplify it?
There are three basic concepts behind this. One is, as Richard Sennett calls it, the openness of a city. How open can you make a city? In other words, not close it down for different, distinct groups who never mix. The second is Sassen's argument, which is about ownership. Who owns the city? How do we actually give it back to different constituents and not give in to what is now the trend in many cities around the world of large companies, corporations, taking over major chunks. And thirdly is, I guess, my contribution to the discussion, which is that design really matters. It's not just a question of planning, it's not just a question of zoning and regulations. It's the quality, it's the section of the street. How wide a street, how tall are the buildings?
The reason for opening up the city is ultimately that this is how you keep a place alive.
I'll sit here. That's fine.
So I'm Michael Kilman. Do you just want to quickly introduce yourself, please?
I'm Richard Sennett, as you know from the film.
Jeannie Birch, University of Pennsylvania.
Saskia Sasson, Columbia University.
So, Richard, let me begin with you. How did this project come to being, the Quito Papers?
As I indicated in the film, it started very informally with a discussion with Juan Clos and other people in UN Habitat about why this document, this Charter of Athens, was so overwhelming to the imagination of planners today. And the conjunction of that question led to the feeling that, well, we shouldn't just do something about it that is verbal, that we should also make a film about that and show what could be different. And in that regard, I would like to thank the filmmaker, and you should stand. This is Dominic Bagnato. This is his film. And what the film attempted to do was show what has been lost in the process of following this model. We then put together a research team, thanks to UN Habitat, and the results of that research into the open city will be published later this month, we hope, by Routledge. There are a series of academic papers which are oriented to this non-academic issue of how can we reimagine the city beyond this functionalist, closed, tight fit between form and function. How can we open up the city? And they're papers for you. They're not for academic specialists, although they employ a lot of academic research. And then the next step was thinking of where could we go that would be a place that would embody this tension, and that took us to Quito, which is both a very forward-looking city, but a city that has been encumbered by some of the planning assumptions made in the 20th century. So that's the shape of this project.
Jeannie, what's the importance of a book like this?
Well, we had a very instructive film from Juan Clos, where he took us through the 20th century and why the Charter of Athens was important. We're now in the 21st century. We now have a legacy of a phenomenal conference that just occurred in the city of Quito. We have new thinking. We have new things that are happening in our world. Technologies have changed. The way people work have changed. Our view of who should own the city has changed. Our view of what an open city has changed. Our view of what works in urban design has changed. Why are we reading these old things? Why aren't we creating for the future the legacy of what the thinking is? And so that's the importance of this book. It's this very important landmark of the conference, Habitat 3, and landmark of the 21st century thinking about what we ought to be thinking about as we build the 60% of the world that is yet to be built as we urbanize.
So, Saskia, okay, so let's sum up for a second. The large trends of the 21st century, we have massive urbanization taking very different forms in the global south and in places like New York City or London. You have rural desertification driven by political conflict, by climate change. You have huge conflicts over accessibility to water. And much of this is driving urban growth. Massive informality as a consequence. At the same time, as Dr. Close said, the proliferation of gated communities. So these are giant issues. And what came up in some of these conversations, and has repeatedly come up, conversations I've had with you over the years, what is the nature of public space? What is the nature of a city that separates it, as you said, Richard, from just an agglomeration of people? I was struck, as many of you here may remember, the Occupy movement some years ago, which took over squares, some of them incidentally privately owned spaces.
Where they could stay the whole night, whereas in the public they could not.
Exactly.
Those are little ironies, right? Yeah.
Absolutely right. But many of these protests took the form of model cities, a kind of template of a polis, a place where people felt they could demonstrate all the different functions of a community in a physical space. I thought that was quite interesting, the way in which public space manifests a notion of a more democratic urban spot.
A commons.
A commons, exactly. So I give this little speech because at the heart of a lot of what has come up here, and I think is within the Quito Papers, is the presumption that we should strive for equity, that that privatization is inherently problematic, that the model of urbanization that grew out of the automobile and the not just Athens, but a whole 20th century idea of what was progress is outmoded. Fair enough. But this is not actually the way cities are growing, and it's not enough, obviously, to say people should not just acquiesce to privatization. There has to be some driving and often economic model for why we should have a more equitable city, why private interests should not have free rein, or what might serve those private interests. So forgive the long speech, but I want to move through repeating the kinds of things which I think we all agree on and look towards what solutions might be.
Well, I think there are two vectors that I would like to bring in. And one of them is a new project that I started, which sort of gets at a lot of these issues, and I call it ethics in the city. In other words, all those beautiful texts about ethics, useless, because they all stop short from the recognition that inevitably a city is a space of enormous inequalities. So then the question becomes, at what point does this enormity of inequalities reach a level where it becomes profoundly unacceptable? Secondly, profoundly destructive of the notion of the city itself. So, that is a bit abstract. But I completely agree with you that this is an issue that most urbanists do not quite confront. It's a tricky one. Now, on this side, I said two vectors. The other vector is that My experience with, and I talked a lot, well, you saw that I talked a lot about low-income people, the disadvantaged. It's that there are these moments when the city really gets it wrong. The city as a complex system, complex but incomplete system. But there are many moments when the city, a park is a good, public transport, where we all become momentarily the rich, the poor, the well-dressed, the badly dressed, urban subjects. And that to me is an anchor for a city. And it is inevitably a momentary. We cannot be full-time urban subjects who are mothers, who are fathers, who are cleaners, who are artists, who are whatever, right? But the capacity of a complex, incomplete, messy, not fully controllable space, because if it doesn't have those elements, it's not a city, to generate us all as urban subjects. And the subway at rush hour, to me, is a great example, where you have all this mix of elements. Now, beyond that final point, we have got to deal, and this is my Who Owns the City project, we have to deal with the fact that buildings are sites for simply hoarding or storing capital, clean or dirty capital. Furthermore, and this is something that simply has not been written about, and it's crucial, those empty buildings we see in Manhattan, we tend to think, oh my God, poor investors. No. You know what is happening? They are functioning as components for asset-backed securities. They're going to be empty a lot, and they're making more money, the owners, the ones that can, than if they were renting them out or selling them out. Now, when you get that, you get a form of death. All those big empty towers, and that they are producing more money by being empty because then they can be used to create asset-backed securities. Now, you tell me how we solve that one, because that is a tough one.
Fair enough, but I think I want to push the conversation towards what the motivations might be, what even the economic and capital motivations for people might be, with private interests, to create a more equitable and vibrant city. I think the issue of transportation came up. You mentioned streets in the video. And after all, public spaces are not just parks and squares, they're also the transit system. And if you look at a place like London, but I'm sure you could give me a million other examples where there have been investments in public transit, big ones, those are not necessarily for people who ride in limousines from their $1 million apartments, right? But they produce both a more equitable city and a more profitable city. So I'd like to push you all towards answering a question, which is not just, is it fair, but how is the functioning of a more equitable city with more vibrant, robust public spaces, how is this actually going to produce this sort of economic growth that will also help those citizens? So, Richard, let me put that question to you.
Such a small question, and actually many questions. If I go back to what we could do, I'll tell you what several of the Quito Papers emphasize on the aspect of design and planning, which is somewhat, if we could solve your economic issue, what would we do? There are three foci that in these papers. One of them is about using public spaces in multiple ways. One of them is about loosening the knot between form and function, making more flexible forms of design. And the third is working with informality rather than working against it. Your transport example is a very good one. There is many of the transport people we talk to want to actually use public transport facilities as ways to organize public space. So they're not just about transport. And that if you need to visit a health clinic, that's in the same place where you take the bus to work. And that's an idea of making public space synchronous, so that, as I mentioned in the film, many things happen at the same time. Incomplete spaces, designing things that can morph into many directions, is against a lot of the way in which we think about planning, which is that you have an objective and then you design a space or a place which fulfills that objective. I was very struck when I first went to Shanghai that a friend of mine who was a chief planner of Shanghai said, I'm going to take you, if you want to know the problem we face, we're going to take a journey on a highway that was so beautifully built, so absolutely perfectly articulated. And he said, the end of our journey is going to be a factory. He's a very wicked man. And we got to the end of the journey, and the factory was there and closed because the factory had moved to Vietnam. That typifies the kinds of problems we're having in urban development when you have this tight fit between form and function. You've got a factory, you've got to get your workers there, you spend millions on a transport system to do it, and the factory moves. So the second big issue that we're pursuing here is how to loosen that so that you can make investments, which is, as the city evolves, that the infrastructure itself
flexible, right? Can take on different.
And that's more difficult than you would think. It's like planning the DNA of something. Now, I'm not God. God did, perhaps, plan the DNA of things. But urban DNA, as opposed to this project-based way of thinking that we have now, making structures, streets, transport systems, buildings flexible, it's a real challenge, and you'll see some of the ways we approach that. The third thing I want to say is that, to me, the most malign forms of planning that we inherited from the 20th century was that informality is a sign that the city has gone wrong. I think we need to work with open-air markets, with squatter settlements, rather than assume that these things are just signs of injury that have to be replaced by something formalized, that we need to find ways to develop them from within so that they become better quality, but that they still retain their DNA as something which is not controlled and not finished. And there's quite a lot of that, again, is easier said than done. But these are the three kinds of emphases. Assuming we could solve Saskia's problem about capitalism, money, injustice, and so on, what would we then do? We would focus on synchronicity, incompleteness or flexibility, and informality as goods for the city.
So we're already doing that in some degree in places where there's slum upgrading and so forth. But what my concern is how we blend and come up with the solutions that the open city provides, but the expertise of the urban designer also provides. So we need arenas in which we can have these discussions. We talk about civil society as having a voice. We talk about businesses having a voice. We talk about governments having a voice. These are all very different groups. And so we need to find the way to come to listen to each other, to then figure out exactly what the solutions are. There's no expert top-down or bottom-up. It's somewhere in the middle. And so where are we going to find those arenas and the time that it will take to do this? Because, as we know, we're built here in the developed world. It's Africa and Asia where this enormous pace of development is occurring. Where are we going to have time to do this? Well, Latin America is pretty well built, but still.
So you raised the very large issue of governance. And I have to say, in my own experience, and that applies whether you're in the United States or in China, whether you're in Latin America or Southeast Asia, the trends that we're seeing, the separation of gated communities from informal settlements, the privatization of so much of the city, this is often driven by either a lack of governance, the acquiescence of governance, but you also have problems here in the developed world in which a breakdown of governance, the acquiescence of governance to private interests, as Saskia's talked about, has produced essentially no more public housing. In the United States, we don't do public housing as a government enterprise anymore.
But our sociologists told us we shouldn't do public housing anymore. It concentrates the poor, therefore we shouldn't do it. What we came up with was a different way of creating affordable housing using the private sector, tax credits, and so forth to do this. I'm sorry to cut in.
No, it's absolutely fine. But, and that is absolutely true, with the consequence that we, in so many cases, try to eke out some tiny benefit for the poor and the working class out of private investments. That's the model that has replaced the construction of public housing, which used to really mean also middle-class housing, because it's the middle class in many cities, not just the developed world, who are increasingly finding it difficult to live in cities, especially as cities prosper more.
We only built 1 million units, by the way, of public housing.
I'm sorry?
We only built 1 million units of public housing, and we have 100 million households.
Right. So, but the question then is, how can we create governance structures that that remind governments not just of the responsibilities to govern, but also of the motivations to create decent public spaces, adequate transit and streets, adequate housing? How do we speak to these many different people in different parts of the world for whom cities mean different things, about having, as you say, a conversation, having government feel that they cannot cede to private interests the development of cities? What is the argument for government involvement?
Well, I think we have to build constituency-based groups, strengthen them so that they can represent their constituencies. It's not a bunch of individuals, but it's constituencies in which we can then have those conversations in a legitimate way. I'm going to turn to Saskia for this one.
Well, I'm not so much of an expert on that, but it seems to me that we should enable adding to what others have said, we should, for instance, enable local small manufacturing or construction companies to do that locally. We should sort of re-territorialize or relocalize a lot of what is involved. We should, I know Austin for a while in Texas. Austin was run by a socialist mayor, and he delegated a lot to the neighborhoods themselves, where you have all kinds of people who know how to do a few things, but who knows what the jobs are that they have, but they have that knowledge. And so that to me seems, besides all the other things that were said, that seems, number two, an absolute serious commitment at all levels of government that the housing question is critical. And that is what we've lost. There was a time when housing, like in Europe, you still have that, housing is seen as critical. You've got to deal with the housing question. And we are sort of not doing that so well, I would say, right? Nor are many global South countries doing that well. And the third element that is absolutely upsetting older modes and older traditions is different versions of land grabs. Look at a city like New York City. It almost feels like a huge system sort of installed itself in areas of the city where there used to be a lot of modest housing, and now it's all very fancy housing. That is happening in city after city. So we have literally expulsions of lower income, of modest middle classes, from places where they thought they would sort of live their lives. So the housing question mobilizes a whole set of major challenges, and I think that if we could address the housing question properly, we would be making progress in a set of other issues as well. I really think less alienation, less violence against outsiders. It just would sort of, I don't want to be too romantic, but I think if we really could do it, it would have a huge halo effect.
If I could just add to this a caveat and an agreement. The caveat is that you can't build something like a transport system locally. That there's a place for large-scale planning. Yeah. But what I agree with you on this, and this is very important, I think, for you when you have investment decisions or planning decisions to make, that the 20th century basically privileged circulation over habitation. The money went into transport, less money than should have went into housing. And if there's one policy recommendation in the Quito Papers for places without much money, not like China, but like Vietnam, it's that it's more supportable to have traffic jams than it is to have housing without plumbing. And we should be putting our efforts in places with little money into housing before we put it into circulation. This is not a good choice because it has implications for the economic development of the urban economy. But the one thing that I became really convinced of as a result of the 3 years of research on this is if you don't have enough money, the first thing you should do is put it into housing. And that's I would say, an overwhelming recommendation of most of the discussions we had in Quito. Build fewer highways.
That makes me nervous when you say housing only, because what we need to do is build communities, not just housing. We've had policies where we focused on housing only, and look what we've gotten. So we need to be thinking about all the things that make a community, and that is, maybe it's equitable transit-oriented development, as people talk about it. It's providing the schools. And it does get back to this idea of providing sufficient public space for community uses. So we have to have space for schools, we have to have schools for parks and streets, as well as housing. So it's not just housing.
I like the fact that you included photographs of in the Quito Papers of a town in the West Bank, near Hebron, where I went, which created, in negotiations with the residents there, a conservative community, a public space where there had been none. And what was interesting about that, I think I spoke to the architects and I spent a good deal of time there talking to residents as well, was that, and it gets to this point about housing, this is a refugee camp, which is of course not a formal city or town, and therefore never was built with the intention that it have any urban qualities, much less amenities. But of course, over the course of 50 years or so, it has become a place, multi-generational, which people identify with, even if they still talk about going home. And so the conversation about creating public space became a conversation about the very nature of their identity, of place, of home. And it raised issues about the relationship among men and women there, young and old, whether there was a notion that women should, in that community, have a public space where they would be seen. So I'm echoing your point by saying that that very successful effort, which created a place where children could play, people could get married and gather, also became the forum for a conversation about the nature of that community itself, its goals, its identity. And I think this is what public space can ultimately do. But I keep coming back to this question, which is, you know, just to say one other anecdote, I remember in Quito running into the mayor of Mexico City. And I had just been in Mexico City, and he had shown me these, not he, but some of his administration had shown me places where the city had tried to improve public space, pedestrianize streets, create bike lanes, do all these things that were climate sensitive and so forth. The federal government in Mexico did everything it could to undermine those efforts. He was potentially going to run for president. They were representing in the federal government completely different interests. This is not only an American problem, it's a problem in many other countries. So I get back to this question of how, because I think this conversation needs to actually take place on the ground, how we deal with these questions of governance, which can't simply be argued by saying this is a good thing. I think it has to come back to the ways in which a majority of people are helped by this, and that the economies of these cities and countries are also served, including those private interests who now have too much of the capital. I keep coming back to this because I think this is something that people need to take away as a practical measure.
So let me get, and then I'll pass it on to you. So I think that one critical factor is that our cities have really changed. It used to be that in some ways they were simpler economies. Today you have all kinds of non-urban sectors, from mining to, which have very big imprints in a city. So the question of governance of a complex urban terrain, if you want, really needs to be revisited. I think you said that, and I completely agree with that. Right now it seems to me that tools are missing. And every now and then you hear a smart mayor address that. And I saw this in Chicago, smart mayor, a bit corrupt, and that willingness to be corrupt enabled him to transform that airport, in the middle of the city into Green Park. Because there was no law that went either way, so to speak. So I think we're talking about a somewhat foundational revisiting and reconstituting of what urban governance means. And the third point is that cities have become far more strategic spaces. We know that when you privatize and deregulate the economy, a lot of stuff no longer runs through governments. It is direct commerce, so to say, or investment or whatever. And cities often lack the tools to handle that properly. So that would be some. Jeannie, you have more to say?
All I was saying is I think it's the rules of the game that we have to, and this is what the New Urban Agenda talked about. There are three things that, it's a very simple recipe the New Urban Agenda has, which is basically urban governance, and getting the governance right, not just urban, managing spatial development, and getting the means of implementation, which is financing and knowledge sharing, capacity building. But let's go back to this governance picture. It's not just the cities that need to get the rules right. It is at every level of government, whichever the arrangement is in a particular country. Correct. The rules have to be there. If they're not there, what can you expect? And so that is a basic principle.
And if I may say, I think the arguments are the economies of countries are improved enormously because of the growth of cities, the increasing importance of cities, by making sure these cities function. You cannot have cities that are only for the wealthy or that are completely divided between wealthy and poor. We know for a fact that functioning cities need to have all different kinds of people able to support themselves, and as you say, Richard, mix freely. So there is an economic argument, there's a prosperity argument to be made even for people who are not in the cities. I want to raise one other issue. You talked a lot about Athens and cars, and I think for many people around the world who haven't thought about this much, they would say, well, in the last century, progress, as Ricky Burdett was pointing out, progress was regarded as moving out of cities, which were dirty places, providing people with green and open space, and the new technology, the new idea, was the automobile, and the notion of having one's own home and a green space was not considered some sort of attack on the city. It was seen as an opportunity for people. This was a goal. It wasn't just an American goal, because we see around the world this remains the model. I think you point out in the Quito Papers that even faster than the growth of population of cities is land use, which is very alarming because of the climate and environmental challenges that poses. But here we have this question of, you're saying we need a different model. We need to return to the notion that the dense city is actually a healthier place. How can most people trust this? Now, this is the new line. The last line was the car in Athens and the big towers in the park. Now you're saying, okay, you shouldn't have believed us back then, but now believe me. Why should we believe you now?
Oh, Michael, how can I arouse trust? You've referred to one aspect of this project, which is quite important, which is the relation between densifying the city and questions of climate and efficient use of energy. As just a statistical fact, one of the interesting things about urbanization today in places like Mexico City is that the city is de-densifying. The densities are falling as you have forms of spread. And we've tried to document that. It's counterintuitive, but we've tried to document it fairly robustly. And you should believe me that a city should become more dense because it's the only way to use energy resources efficiently. And urban space. But I'm just responding to this. It is true, you can say people don't want this, right? They want to live in suburbs, leafy suburbs, don't see your neighbor. Blacks never enter the perimeter of the gated community and so on. But there is an element of this. I think that gated communities should be outlawed on ecological grounds because both as well as justice grounds, the only way that we can address, and this is a discussion you remember we had between the people in Paris in 2015 and when we began planning for urban habitat, the only way to really use the city positively as an element in dealing with climate change is to redensify it and make it more compact. And people may not want that. Too bad. It's something that needs to be done. And it takes the will of government to say, this has to happen.
19th century city was an awful place. It really was.
Horrible.
TB, crowded, no services, etc. I mean, it really was awful. And so the lure of green, sunny places was very strong. So knowing that Richard wants us to have compact cities and says we're going to do it regardless, we have to think about why would people want to live in a compact city? How do we make that compact city an alternative that's a consumer alternative that is useful? It's got to have the open space that's useful. It's got to have the walkability. It's got to have the amenities that will make it competitive with the suburban space that people might leave. And so I think we have to think about that. We also have to think about the fact that we have suburban spaces, and how can we make those spaces more practical, more energy efficient, if you may, or more urban, if we are trying to work on sustainability. So it's what are the amenities that we have to make this attractive?
I know, Saskia, you've thought a lot about why people are leaving the countryside, what is forcing them out, and what the economies of the rural areas are as a consequence. Obviously, they're coming to cities because they're looking, in many cases, for opportunity. That's where the jobs are. They're driven there often by desperation, but they need to find something in the city. They're looking to support their families. They're looking to educate their children. That in itself is driving the growth of cities. What is the motivation of the cities to want more of those people?
Well, it varies a bit. Some people are not wanted. And not everything is like New York and London, let's put it that way, right? Big cities that can actually integrate a lot more people than they have in many senses. But there is an emergent new history And it's going to hit cities harder and harder. It's already hitting. And that is massive land grabs. Richard, don't start laughing because he knows that I'm now really into land grabs. So this is an invisible history from the perspective of the urbanite. You don't see the land grabs. Secondly, it's partly invisible because the people who are being expelled, we're talking at least 1 million in the global south every year. Huh? Those are very rough estimates. Where do they go? They go to the big slums. Now, the slums at the center of the slum, they tend to be reasonable economies, especially that is close to the normal economy. But at the edges, there are spaces of complete misery. And you see this in Rio de Janeiro, you see it in African cities. So, but if these land grabs continue, and really most of the land is now privately owned by the Nestle's, the Coca-Colas, the mines, the et cetera, plantation economy that has risen. So we are facing an emergent set of conditions for which cities are absolutely not ready. And I don't know how it's going to go. I mean, again, the United States is a huge country. Europe is a bit different. They know how to urbanize properly. But now I'm thinking about other parts, Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. And that is something that I think urbanists need to address. They need to address these millions of people who are being expelled from their land. They don't want to leave their land. They're being thrown out.
So the last question is, how do we persuade people of the goodness of the common good? We're talking here a lot about this notion of the common good.
We don't have to persuade them. They know. Some of the images that we have in the films, and they know when it's there and they know when it's not, whether that's in a slum or whether that is in a modest neighborhood or whether that's in a very fancy suburb. I do think that we don't need to persuade them.
What do you mean by the common good?
The common ground. I thought you said something which is shared. And
oh, okay. So what are the goods of the commons, all right? So it's the right to live, the right to be safe, the right to be healthy, the right to educate your children, the right to earn a living. All those things are the common good. And how do we create the frames in which people can get the common good? And that's the conversation, the governance question that we have, the basic amenities, the principles of the good life.
All right, we did it.
Well, I'd just like to say as a final comment on this, that I've worked in and out of the UN almost all my life. And one of the things that is very satisfying to me about this project, which was Habitat 3, is that I hope it spreads within the UN as a notion that rather than thinking at the nation-state level, which is our impulse, that we inside the UN, think much more at the level of the urban. And things will look different that way. Policy becomes much more concrete, and it asks different sets of questions than it does when we think at the urban level. One way to think about this was that in the past, we always looked at the local nested like one of those Russian dolls inside the metropolitan inside the regional inside the national. And I think that way of thinking has to change, and that we need to focus on the city as a whole, as something in itself. And when I say we, I mean us in the UN, to think less about the nation state and more about the state of the city.
I agree with that. I think it's good.
I want to thank you all. I think we've solved all of the urban problems of the world. And I would just say this is, of course, the right place to have this conversation and begin the kind of governance and other issues that you're talking about, Richard. So thank you. And thank you so much, the ambassador.
That's right.
And thank you, everybody, for coming and listening. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. I would like to thank, of course, Ecuador for hosting this with us, Ambassador, and the panel, Michael Kimmelman, Richard Sennett, Eugenie Birch, and Saskia Sassen for being here. Maybe another round of applause for them. Just a quick announcement. We will continue this debate across the streets with civil society. It's on the in the church center on the 8th floor. We'll continue talking about the new urban agenda and exactly engaging in a more interactive dialogue with all of you. So hope you can cross. There's no need for a security pass. You can just go across and go in. And the book that we started to pre-launch here will be out later, probably in a month's time. There are some forms on the side of the room if you're interested to pre-register your interest in the book. Just pick up a form from the side of the room and possible discount if you do so now. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.